I spent the first 13 years of my professional life working and running record stores. If you're too young to have experienced one, I should point out that the record store wasn't merely a place where you'd go to buy a record, cassette tape, or CD. It was a meeting ground where tastes were defined, interests sparked, love affairs kindled. They were social places, temples to a truer religion than you could find in any church. If you were a young person in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, you probably get what I'm saying. And a deep pang of nostalgia and regret probably just hit you. Strange way to start a video about a horror movie. Hang with me a moment. Alternative rock exploded pretty much right as I was entering the business. It was a very exciting time. Change all around. Glam metal bands like the Bullet Boys, Danger Danger, and Firehouse looked one moment like they'd be inheriting the rock world. Nirvana's Nevermind is often cited as a key turning point away from glam. But Jane's Addiction, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam were all making plenty of noise on the scene by the time Smells Like Teen Spirit cemented the sea change upon release on September 10th, 1991. There was one other band that deserves to be mentioned. Actually, there are dozens, but the one that is relevant here is Alice in Chains. Their album Facelift had come out the previous summer and gave the world its first bona fide alternative hit, Man in the Box. Thing is, grunge fans aren't the only ones who like to claim Alice in Chains. Glam rockers, heavy metal kids, fans of 70s rock, college rock devotees, all considered Alice in Chains to be part of their scene. The 2009 horror film The Collector has always been in the same boat. Made during the so-called torture porn cycle ignited by the twin successes of Saw and Hostel, The Collector borrows equally from other traditions, home invasion, slashers, the serial killer thriller. It was a rare film that could count fans of Funny Games, The Abominable, Dr. Phibes, and I Know What You Did Last Summer among their supporters. But even so. The Collector is fondly remembered by many horror fans when prompted, but very little effort is brought towards elevating this film to the status it deserves, because unlike virtually all the films released in those post-Scream, pre-Hereditary days, The Collector understood the moment in which it lived. Horror was evolving. Some would say for the better, some would say for the worse. But unlike the clumsy attempts at relevance typified by Rob Zombie's Halloween and Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell, this is the one that had the storytelling chops to meet that moment. The movie opens on a suburban street at night. There's immediately some ambiguous details here. Crickets trapped in a streetlight, police tape in front of an otherwise normal home, building an unsettling sense that we're going into a story late. Things have already happened that we're not privy to. It's very natural for viewers to become anxious when they feel like they're missing essential information, and this prologue smartly plunges forward without trying to explain itself. A lesser film would have begun with the couple in the car discussing recent events that are bothering them, or at least reacting to the police tape. But this movie understands that the audience's sense of dread is more important than the story at this point. Instead, we go inside the house with the couple. It's dark and tinted in subdued blue hues. Impossible to get a sense of the geography of the house. The man tries to get the lights on while the woman goes upstairs to get ready for bed. This is normal enough behavior in everyday life, but as a viewer who's seen this sort of thing a million times before in other movies, we think of them splitting up as another portent of danger. The woman screams for the man and he rushes upstairs. In the center of their bedroom sits an antique storage box with a note on top of it that says, "For the collection." The box rattles, and as the man opens it, he's attacked from behind by a previously unseen assailant. At first glance, this all feels like routine horror movie stuff. In horror literature, these prologues started appearing in the very late 1960s, and became a ubiquitous formula until the early 2000s. The idea is to introduce disposable characters and feed them to the big bad, so once that the real lead characters are introduced, the stakes they face are already established. It has become so much of a trope that it's joked about in professional writing circles viciously, almost as much as the common solutions to the dreaded cell phone problem. But there's a clever twist here in the sequence's intentional murkiness. We don't see what happens to anyone here. There's no resolution. In fact, although I assume everyone instantaneously knew what was inside the box, there's not even a reveal of what was collected inside of it. For the moment, it's allowed to remain a literal mystery box. The box itself always recalled the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey to me. It's similar in shape, and because it appears almost magically where it does not belong, it shares a similar importance to the plot. Exposure to the monolith begins an evolution towards modern man in 2001. In The Collector, the couple's life is drastically altered because the box is there, because this mystery has entered their life. The very definition of the uncanny is when the ordinary takes on a sense of unfamiliarity and alienness. This can happen for reasons that we don't really understand or with things we can't put our finger on. An antique storage box, in its proper context, is not frightening or off-putting at all. One that appears in your bedroom in the middle of the night? Now that is nightmare fuel. And replaces the following the most industrial rock opening credit sequence this side of early David Fincher. The film introduces us to our main character, Arin. We first see him from behind as he removes tape from a newly installed window. This is an unusual way for a protagonist to enter a film. Usually, we get a static shot of the main character in center frame facing the camera, essentially facing the viewer. Sometimes the camera slowly zooms in to give us a close-up, a glamour shot. This lets us know the person we're looking at is important and likely to carry the rest of the film. It's not even rare for the actor to be asked to glance directly into the camera for a split second to reinforce the connection between the character and his audience. Here, however, we get the opposite. Arin, like the mystery box, is not defined. He turns to address his boss, the owner of a palatial estate he's renovating, not to the audience. He's polite and reserved, but there's an air of resignation to him. He's a man who's lost more battles than he's won in life. There's no exposition here at all. We witness only what he sees and without context. He's dressed modestly in what are clearly department store work clothes. But he's surrounded here at work by wealth. His boss is a rich man, presumably from the work of laborers like Arin. His boss's wife injects herself with Botox, not because she needs it, she's naturally very beautiful, but because she's clearly chasing perfection. The boss's daughter invites him to a tea party. He tries his best to fit in, but even the daughter is filled with the aura of privilege. He asks her what she would want if she could have any gift in the whole world, and she says an expensive teddy bear. He doesn't even know what it is or where he can get it, because it's so far removed from the world that he lives in. We understand his barely off-screen frustration. He fixes their doors and replaces their windows, but they are the rich ones, and he's sinking. That the movie delivers all this within a few minutes, without exposition to blatantly scream it at the audience, displays a trust that most filmmakers, or at least the studios they serve, don't feel comfortable with. It's easy to imagine a scene where one of the other co-workers would commiserate with Arin and both would complain about the wealth gap. But that would violate the film's core narrative stance. The story is in the box, and the box is the mystery. Up to now, it's impossible to say whether the film will portray Arin as a hero or as a villain. His disillusionment and desperation could lead him either way, to the underdog fighting his way, a la Rocky, or the soulless vigilantism of a Travis Bickle. But then there's a quick beat. Arin stops the boss's daughter from lifting a cup to her lip because a spider hangs from its side. And that's him. He might resent the world that the daughter lives in, but he doesn't hate her. He's lost more fights than he's won, but he's still inside the ropes and swinging. After a tense ending to the tea party, Arin excuses himself and goes outside. As he smokes a cigarette, what appear to be great black wasps land on his arm and hand. His gaze follows them back to their giant nest. The early chapters of this film have insects on screen so often that it's clearly not just intentional, but that the bugs are meant as part of a secondary narrative. We've seen spiders galore by this point, in the opening credits outside the boss's home, on the daughter's teacup. Much like the opening to David Lynch's Blue Velvet, in which a well-manicured suburban lawn is revealed to only camouflage an infestation of insect pests just below their surface, The Collector uses spiders and crickets and wasps as a micro-society that will mirror the movements of the surface plot. The name Arin itself sounds very much like the name of an insect, doesn't it? Seeing the wasps, Arin remains calm and blows cigarette smoke at them, sending them away. I think most of us would have instinctively swatted our hand and arm in a quick, panicked response. Perhaps out of some perceived kinship, Arin just moves them along without any violence. On his way off the worksite, he passes an exterminator's truck with a spider logo on its side. Now, usually exterminators choose mice, cockroaches, or ants as mascots for their businesses. I'm sure that spiders are a common enough nuisance in that trade, but they're hardly as marketable. This is an intentional choice on the part of the filmmakers. Also, please notice the body shape of the exterminator that Arin speaks with. He's tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in all black, and wearing a mask. We'll be seeing a lot more of him. We're not quite done with discussing insects, though. Jill, the boss's older daughter, introduces herself to Arin. She even asks, what kind of name is Arin, to highlight the unusual phonetics of the name. She's lightly flirting with him, but he's quick to pick up on the danger of even being seen with her. She's aware, too. She asks for a drag of his cigarette, and he ultimately gives in. She's clearly studying his reaction to her. It's very much like a praying mantis or a spider tempting a fly, or I suppose a great black wasp, into her web. She's even dressed in green and black, a color combination that feels very much in line with the predatory world of insects. And what does she do when she reaches the house? Climbs up the trellis and sneaks into her bedroom window. The surface plot would have it that she's sneaking in to avoid her parents after having been out all night, but that's an excuse to facilitate the visual language of the film. The boss pays Arin in cash for his work that week, adding a little extra for his daughter. This seems generous, but let's look a little bit deeper. The boss is clearly paying Arin under the table. There's no health care, 401k match, or any other benefits, although clearly the man could afford to do all of that. He's chosen to pay a man who is desperate to make money in the way that's most cost-effective for him. Arin's kind of similar, though, too. At first he declares that he can't take any more than he's earned, but considering what he has planned, you can't quite see him as someone who values integrity. These are men communicating on two different levels. Social norms up top, their true intentions the iceberg below. But they're both looking out for number one. That's also how this story in this film is being told, on two different levels simultaneously. And if you choose to read the second story, you'll get a much more robust experience. The next 5 minutes of screen time contain the film's only real framing sequences. As before, the film gives us information through brief snippets of conversation rather than true exposition. The dialogue smartly avoids over-explaining a situation that both participants would jointly already know. Ever watch one of those police investigation shows where one cop turns to the other and explains how a crime scene test works, even though that their partner clearly would already know all that? That's dialogue written for the audience and not for the other person in the conversation. And frankly, it's shit. Here, there's as much unsaid in 3 quick conversations as is being said. That's called trusting your audience. It also allows you to steamroll right through anything unimportant and get the plot in motion. Arin's daughter is introduced drawing at a table in a bowling alley where her mom works or manages or something. It's not real clear, right? And right there, you see, it really doesn't matter what her position at the bowling alley is, so we're not distracted by unimportant details. What is important is that Cindy, the daughter, is growing up in a distinctly unhealthy environment. Arin gifts her with the stuffed bear that his boss's daughter mentioned as wanting. It's not stated, but it's clearly insinuated that this is a birthday gift, and that maybe birthday gifts haven't been an annual tradition. Lisa, Arin's wife, berates him for not having the money she needs to repay loan sharks. How did she get into this trouble? What exactly is the state of Arin and Lisa's marriage? Again, unimportant. It's only the life and death nature of the conflict that carries any weight, so that's all we get. This bare-bones approach has a naturalistic, if minimalist, David Mamet feel. Every word matters, if only because of their scarcity. Also, this focuses the audience on the stakes. Life has been reduced to the rules of the animal kingdom, or perhaps insect kingdom. Survival is the only thing that matters. For Lisa, even a stuffed bear on her daughter's birthday is an unnecessary distraction. Arin meets his fence, Roy, in an alley behind a strip club to arrange a deal. Roy doesn't like it when Arin tries to set the terms, as he needs money for Lisa by midnight. Their little power struggle, complete with hair being burnt off Arin's wrist, the same wrist that the Wasps landed on, clearly showcases just how far down the food chain Arin lives. He has to wait for his turn at the waterhole, that's for sure. So there's the plot. Arin has to rob jewelry from his boss's house while the rich man is on vacation in order to keep his hanging-by-a-thread family afloat. Everyone's motivations are clear. The ticking clock is set. All done in 5 minutes. You have to wonder what percentage that is in the lifespan of a fly. Okay, and here we go. I'm either going to make some of you watch this film differently from now on, or I'm going to lose you entirely. Arin's heist begins with a foggy drive to his boss's house. This isn't just condensed water vapor, not just a lower atmospheric weather condition. This is his journey into his own underworld, his psyche, filled with all his fears and regret and self-loathing. Like most good modern horror, The Collector is a film about personal failure. Am I suggesting that the film's events all take place inside Arkin's head? No, and yes. The surface narrative is meant to be taken entirely separately from the internal psychological secondary narrative. The two do not contradict as much as inform each other. This movie's minimalist storytelling concept is very distinct from the secondary narrative choices of, say, Fight Club, where the audience is eventually shown behind the curtain. The surface narrative here, robbing a rich man's house in a Robin Hood fantasy, isn't new to the horror genre. Two recentish examples are The People Under the Stairs and Don't Breathe. In both of those, sympathetic characters discover that no matter how bad their lives are, crime is not a credible answer to class inequity. Actually, People Under the Stairs kind of fucks up its themes in its final moments, so maybe I shouldn't have chosen that example. The surprise at this point in the story may very well be how proficient Arkin is at robbery. He's shown as a talented lockpicker and safecracker, but does that feel right? I mean, if this is meant as a realistic story, why is this world-class robber's family in debt to begin with? Why does his fence treat him as a low-tier wannabe criminal not worthy of respect? The answer is simple. Arkin isn't the skilled criminal that we see. We're seeing him through a very filtered lens. We're seeing him through the story he tells himself in his own head. Note that this master criminal is wearing a ski mask with a massive hole in the side of its face. That's pretty telling. A side note, I'm not considering the sequel, The Collection, in this autopsy. Any piece of art should be judged on its own, not by its derivative works. Sequels necessarily dilute the storytelling techniques and themes of their progenitors. As he works on the boss's safe, he discovers that he's not alone in the house. His boss is still there, albeit in bad shape, as is a mysterious intruder, who we'll call the Collector because that's the title of the film. When he's discovered, his boss asks him, why is he doing this? And that's the real question, isn't it? Sure, his wife has a debt to repay, and he's trying to save his family, but he's also breaking into the house and stealing from a family whose daughter he had a tea party with earlier that day. Have you noticed how similar the Collector and Arkin's wardrobe is? The boss falls victim to an elaborate trap, worthy of Saw's John Kramer on his very best day at the design desk. It's also a wholly impractical trap, as it would only work properly if a million tiny details all aligned. Arkin attempts to escape the house but discovers the windows boarded up, the deadbolts all destroyed in their locked positions, and booby traps set throughout the house. Wait, what? How long did the Collector have to set those traps up? Has he been in the house working all day? And if so, has the boss been restrained all this time and only escaped right when Arkin got there? It stretches credulity to its threadbare max. If we're taking this all as realistic, that is. Taken as a psychological projection, as a secondary narrative from a third-person restricted point of view, it all works just fine. Arkin finds himself cornered with the Collector approaching, so he flees into the basement. Basements, of course, are a familiar enough metaphor for the subconscious, but are also a place where children fear monsters dwell. For Arkin, it's clearly both. He finds his boss there, bolted to a chair and bleeding. Make no mistake, this is a conversation happening in the surface narrative between a real wounded man and another man trying to avoid a similar fate. But in the secondary narrative, this is a man facing the mirror and seeing himself broken and bloodied and pathetic. Look closely at how this shot is composed. Normally, a two-shot conversation between two characters alternates between an establishing shot of both characters in frame and separate shots over the shoulder of each as the other speaks. Watch virtually any film or TV show for an example of this. And then watch this conversation closely. While there are a few brief cuts where the traditional approach is used, the longer shots are either the establishing shot with the men mirroring each other or shots from Arkin's point of view. Now go back to that typical example from any other film. I'm sure you'll see the difference. It's subtle, like everything else in the storytelling of the Collector, but once you see it, it's unmistakable. You can't unsee it. The boss tells Arkin he has a gun in the bedroom safe and gives him the combination. Interesting that both with the Collector in the house and even if he's not there, the solution to Arkin's problems is in the same place. In a box, albeit this one is embedded in a wall. And just for good measure, what's the box hiding behind? A mirror. Still in the basement, he finds the boss's wife, Victoria, gagged and bound in a bathtub with duct tape over her eyes. Now, maybe you're in the camp that feels that looking too deeply into movies is a mistake, and that you'll always end up reading too much into every little thing or every scene. But then you have to ask yourself this. What in the fuck is a bathtub doing in a basement? And don't create some elaborate backstory in your head to justify it. This is pure abstraction. In fiction, that's when a writer uses an incongruent element to establish mood, atmosphere, or a psychological state, even though it betrays the logic of a story's setting. If you've seen the film A Knight's Tale, you'll recognize that the presence of rock music in a medieval story gives the movie a free-spirited nature that wouldn't be possible without that bit of nonsensical audio set dressing. The same thing here, but again, more subtly. That bathtub has no logical reason to exist in a basement against a cold brick wall, but it's there because a woman in a bathtub, even especially clothed, drags in a whole lot of baggage that the film can use to make the situation feel more desperate and chaotic. Arin asks Victoria to scream in order to draw the collector towards her so he can escape back upstairs. He's now charged with finding and protecting her youngest daughter, Hannah, who he's told is hiding somewhere inside the house. He comes up with this plan. It's curiously reckless. He knows nothing about the collector, at least not consciously, except that the intruder has booby-trapped the house and captured and tortured the owners. He very well could be getting Victoria killed with this plan. Sure, he tells her to stop screaming when the collector gets near so he doesn't hurt her any further, but what? It's all very, very reckless. Who knows what's going to happen, and it could cost this woman her life. Unless, of course, all is not at all what it seems. So she screams. A big, robust horror movie scream, as loud and impassioned as Janet Leigh's badass shampoo commercial. Not including the pre-credits scene, up until this point in the film, Arin has been the only point-of-view character. Every moment has been centered around him. Maybe that seems like a routine thing, but do yourself a favor and pay attention next time you turn on one of your favorite movies. Single point-of-view features are very rare, mostly because it's so much more difficult to relay a fully functioning, four-leg structured story when you have to rely on a single character's perspective. That's why so many movies rely on lazy dialogue or voiceover exposition. It's also the reason why telling a story from a secondary character's point of view is so much more common. The Shawshank Redemption is Andy Dufresne's story, but it is told through the eyes of Red, for example. Another popular solution is to have two or more point-of-view characters whose stories eventually collide. Halloween has both Laurie Strode and Dr. Loomis as point-of-view characters, and that allows for both framework and linear storytelling to happen at the same time. Without Loomis, we'd have to find some other way, maybe a clumsy radio news bulletin interrupting Don't Fear the Reaper on the car radio, to provide the audience with the necessary information to understand what's happening in the movie, what the drama really is. But with Loomis, we get all the drama and suspense without any interruption from exposition. Ever wonder why Loomis is driving to the asylum in the middle of the night? It's because he needs to witness the escape so we can witness the escape. But here, in The Collector, we have our first example of a break in the first-person narrative as we follow the Collector into the basement where he threatens to torture Victoria and does assault Michael. This is intercut with Arin sneaking upstairs to retrieve Michael's gun from the safe as well as to search for Hannah. The intercut sequence is brisk and breathless, and that's for a reason, because, of course, it has to change pace with the story around it to signify to the viewer that they should view the scene differently. By now it should be clear that Michael's family is a mental avatar for Arin's vision of his own American dream. The beautiful house, the perfect wife, innocent daughter. We'll get to the older sister in a bit. But what does that make the Collector? An intruder in his psyche as well as his dream house, one who sets booby traps and boards up the windows. Remember that we watched Arin bolt bars onto an upstairs window in the beginning of this movie. The intruder is Arin's sense of failure. It's his rage against all the things he wants but he can't achieve. He blames class. The failure is his, but he hasn't faced up to it yet, so the chase is on. And, by the way, Michael's family name? Chase. It's not a coincidence. Arin is chasing the American dream. Opening the safe, he holds a diamond in one hand and a bulletless gun in the other. Arin is at a crossroads. He holds two forms of salvation: the money that will save his family and the weapon to destroy his enemy. In terms of Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera, this is the scorpion and the grasshopper moment. But let's take another detour for a moment. I'm sure you thought of this when you were first watching The Collector, just as I was. Let's assume that Arin breaks into his boss's house, steals the diamond, and the Collector kills all the family except the one he kidnaps. What would the police investigator think? Arin's DNA is all over the crime scene. He's been seen at the house by the extermination team. Simply put, Arkin is flat out prom date on Quaalude's fucked. And a diamond? Do people actually own large diamonds like this in real life as a form of money that you can just keep it in the safe? Wouldn't it be in a safety deposit box or somewhere much more secure than in the family safe? It's clear that this is meant as a totem, an item that represents wealth rather than a literal diamond. Because let's face it, outside those let's buy gold as a secure hedge against the market commercials on the radio, no one owns this stuff. We have bank accounts. Rich people have just bigger bank accounts. Arkin calls out for Hannah, but there's a thumping sound from the closet instead. Opening it, he finds the antique box from the beginning of the film. Unlike the safe, he has no trouble opening it, and out crawls Larry Wharton, the victim from the prologue. Larry immediately tells Arkin to get out and explains that the collector takes one victim and kills the rest. This would count as exposition, except it is the only possible reading of the scenario. It doesn't really matter if someone says it out loud. It's not really telling the viewer anything he doesn't know or hasn't just figured out. It's also as strange as hell modus operandi for a serial killer. Just as Larry found another victim in a box in his own home, he's now the one in a fresh crime scene. And it doesn't take a brilliant prognosticator to realize where this is all heading for Arkin, does it? This always brought to mind Russian nesting dolls to me. Boxes within boxes, houses as boxes, safes as boxes, ultimately people and psyches as boxes. Inexplicably, Arkin relocks Larry in the box and continues his search for ammunition for the revolver, the missing daughter Hannah, and a way out of this nightmare scenario. What harm would it really do to let Larry stay out? Sure, he's making noise that might attract the collector, but isn't that just what he did to Victoria a moment ago? And, by the way, he noticed the sound of Larry thumping in the box in the closet. Why wouldn't he assume that that would draw the collector out? No. Larry's put back in the box in the subconscious where he came from. We hit the third act with an abrupt change in the velocity of every scene. From here on out, there's a frenetic pace that just doesn't let up. This comes out as particularly jarring on the first watch, as the second and first act are pretty somber and reserved, more suspense than shock. But that's done now, in large part because the mystery box has been opened. Pandora's box, if you will. And now Arkin has to either solve his dilemma, his failing quest for the American dream, or die trying. His first challenge is a room with a floor covered in a yellow, acidic adhesive. It's already trapped the family cat, and Arkin soon finds his shoes spot welded to the floor and melting. The cat yowls and hisses. Again worried that this will attract the collector, he yanks the cat off the floor and tosses it to its death at a guillotine window trap. Can't help reflecting on his use of Victoria as bait, or his decision to stuff Larry back into the box, can you? What follows is a Saw franchise-esque game of the floor is lava, with Arkin using books as stepping stones. The collector reaches the room right as he hides, but seeing the dead cat, or half of it anyway, he apparently is fooled and turns out of the room. Arkin heads back to the basement again, this time with a paperclip in hand to free Victoria from her handcuffs. But first he finds Michael strung upside down and gutted, dead. Given that Michael represents Arkin's vision of a successful man, this is a critical find. Although we don't spend much time here, it's a definitive moment. His hopes and dreams are starting to crash down around him. After all, if a man with everything going in his favor can't survive, what chance does he have? He frees Victoria and tells her that he'll find Hannah, but that the two of them have to escape the house. Having to walk past Michael's corpse to leave the basement, he tells her to focus on his back as they walk. This, much like the story of Lot's wife, is pretty much doomed to failure. She sees Michael, loses her shit, and bolts towards the stairs. The collector's waiting at the top and stabs her before she falls back down to the basement concrete. What does Arkin do? Hide. Again. Are you starting to see a recurring theme with this guy? He refuses to face the collector. He's searching for a shortcut out of the situation that won't involve actually dealing with the monster. He wants the American dream, but he doesn't want to actually have to fight for it. And part of that dream is the perfect wife, if you remember. Now badly injured and dragged into that improbable basement bathroom, that part of his American dream seems to be slipping away as well. So he hides. The collector comes towards him but stops. He's not after Arkin, but instead rescues a spider from a water pipe and brings it to a small window and frees it. I don't think I have to explain that. We break point of view again and follow the collector into the basement bathroom where he records Victoria's screams while he sews her mouth shut. This is an interesting substitution of the sound safe-cracking device used to detect the chase's safe's dialing mechanism. There's already been a number of parallels drawn between Arkin and the Collector, but this one I think has a cool underlying premise. Is the sound of a lock's mechanism turning as a family's wealth is about to be robbed from them comparable to a scream? A bit more subtle than putting both men in masks, but a whole lot more meaningful, I think. Arkin heads back upstairs. Curious how the Collector chose to booby-trap some of the pathways throughout the house, but not others, isn't it? And unlike earlier where Arkin was so careful to avoid tripwires, he's moving quick here, as if he's already cataloged where all the deadly traps are, which makes no sense in the surface narrative at all, but plenty in the secondary. The house itself, the American dream itself, really, is the trap. And then we get to the sequence that feels most like a traditional horror film. In fact, I'd say it could be substituted in for the opening of Fulci's House by the Cemetery, the teenage kills in Psycho 2, or practically any Friday the 13th or Halloween banana hitchhiker kill. The chase's older daughter, Jill, arrives with her boyfriend intent on a night of sex. They make out in the car to Bauhaus's Bela Lugosi's Dead, a song about life imitating art, and then move to the porch. Unable to get in, they pound on the door. Larry, in his box, also thumps away in the upstairs closet, and Arkin joins in briefly in this weird drum line, trying to break through the slats on a window and escape like that spider in the basement. The Collector unlocks the back door, and the young couple obliviously make their way in, and then start making out, unaware that the Collector's watching from the next room. This all feels very familiar, right? The kind of cut-and-paste scene that feeds almost all of those lowest common denominator horror flicks. But a cool moment. Whereas Bela Lugosi's Dead played on the car stereo in the surface plot, it's added to the soundtrack of the film as the couple get frisky on the kitchen table. The film is acknowledging its onion layers. And that is very cool. And then the boyfriend dies horrifically, because really, this is a horror film after all. I promised we'd get back to the older daughter Jill's role in the secondary narrative. She's the one member of the Chase family that does not have an analog in Arkin's family. When we first meet her, she flirts with Arkin, and importantly, he only begrudgingly doesn't respond to her advances. The impression is, in that early scene, he would have reacted very differently if he didn't fear being discovered by Michael. A darker part of the American dream, for men anyway, is the push-pull attraction of the idea of a younger woman. If you've seen the film American Beauty, or any adaptation of Lolita, you get the idea. Yes, Nabokov was Russian, but the sensibilities of his most famous work align remarkably well with the current Western male psyche. Still doubt me? Browse for the most popular adult video clips online. It won't take long. Arkin's wife is cold and distant, very much beaten down by stress. You have to imagine that their romantic life and physical intimacy is nearly non-existent, so Jill fills that void, at least mentally. Also, remember their earlier interaction? She asks what kind of name is Arkin, and he responds by asking what kind of a name is Jill. Well, that's pretty telling. You're seeing how intentional the names of all these characters are, right? First off is the notion of Jack and Jill, the nursery rhyme. Jill has become a stand-in word for any girl, and Jack for any guy. Both words have been co-opted as terms for masturbation, and the rhyme itself implies a first sexual experience that ends in tragedy. Nursery rhymes, like urban legends, campfire stories, and EC horror comics, often present as morality tales to help guide children away from dangerous behavior. Puritanical, perhaps, but not without some value. The Collector approaches Jill much differently than he did to her boyfriend. There's an unmistakable sexual predator vibe to his motions. This maps to the earlier scene where he watched the couple make out and is shown licking his lips. He's even about to pull away Jill's bra when an alarm clock rings out, stopping him in his tracks. Arkin uses sound again as a distraction. Also worth considering the implication. The Collector, or Arkin himself, is being awakened out of a sexual dream by an alarm clock. You get the impression that this isn't the first morning that has happened. Once you notice, the subtlety of the storytelling is not hard to see. Still not convinced? Well, what follows? Arkin somehow sneaks downstairs. Wait! Let's stop there. We've already established that only one staircase in the house doesn't have booby traps. How exactly did Arkin get to Jill without crossing paths with the Collector on his way down? Sure, we see the Collector cut down some wires in a sexual frustration-induced rage, but that doesn't mean the two wouldn't come face to face. No, the film is no longer worried about the surface and secondary narrative's logic remaining airtight if it ever really was. No, this is about Arkin, not the Collector or Jill or the chases. Arkin frees Jill. Look at the framing of this scene. Arkin has literally replaced the Collector in the shot. She asks him why he's there, and he doesn't answer. She recoils from him, treating him virtually the same as she did the Collector. Maybe she thinks it's the same man, and he's just taken off his mask. I mean, she's not wrong. She reaches for a weapon, a pair of scissors, to defend herself. To me, this is an easy callback to Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder. If you've seen it, you know. But before she can put them to use, she triggers a booby trap and is flung into a wall of spikes and dies. The short side of it is this. Once she's rejected him, and that part of Arkin's American dream falters, the house, his box, disposes of her. That she's impaled is, well, self-explanatory. That leaves only young Hannah as the last component to his dream. Whereas Michael and Victoria represented his past failures and Jill his current one, his daughter, mirrored by Hannah, is his future. Before we continue with Hannah, take a quick look at Jill's body. She's impaled on a retractable home movie screen. A Super 8 projector throws images of the family's former Norman Rockwell life. But what's on that soundtrack? It sounds more like pornography. We're deep in David Lynch territory here, where digging under the backyard soil even a little bit brings out all the rot and infestation. With his awful batting average still in play, Arkin rushes upstairs to attempt to save Larry. He abandons this pretty quickly because, you guessed it, the wounded man is making noise. Instead, Arkin breaks through that window he's seemingly been working on all night, scuttles down the terrace, and runs from the house. He doesn't get far, though, before he catches a glimpse of Hannah in an upstairs window, and the Collector in a downstairs window, head raised towards the sound of Hannah pleading for help. He pauses for a moment, then runs back towards the house, unable to resist one last chance at his American dream. As the Collector chases Hannah Chase, we catch a quick shot of his eyes, now supernaturally glowing green. This isn't just a natural effect of stage lights, it's obviously intentional. This, of course, is a symbol of jealousy in just about every culture, but maybe is best known for the story of Cupid and Psyche, love and mind. When Cupid turns feral with jealous rage, his eyes turn green. What is the Collector, and by extension Arkin, jealous of? The Chase house, its family, its prosperity. Arkin finally confronts the Collector at the top of the main staircases and manages to best him in a surprise attack. Finally, he's willing to fight for the survival of his American dream's future. He locks himself inside Hannah's bedroom. He overturns her fish tank just as the Collector breaks through the door. Hannah throws her television down, but the Collector's apparently anticipated all this and has used Larry as a battering ram. Larry's electrocuted, and yeah, there's no way in any reasonable narrative that the Collector could have possibly predicted any of that. Like all of his traps, 1,000 things would have needed to happen precisely as planned. No, although the action is fast and exciting and distracting, the story is clearly moved from literal into something else. Hannah and Arkin escaped into the laundry room. Arkin runs into a string of fishhooks dangling from the ceiling and has his eyebrow pierced. This has nothing to do with secondary narrative or themes or anything. I don't think, anyway. But I find it ironic that he gets stabbed by fishhooks immediately after condemning the family's goldfish to death. Once he frees himself, he lowers Hannah down the laundry chute into the basement. Sure, every horror fan is having Halloween 5 flashbacks at this point. And you'll have them again, too. I'm one of those nuts that loves Halloween 5 for what it tries to do, and even if it fails mostly, and it does fail mostly, it feels like this film is openly acknowledging a similar appreciation. It also pulls off some of what that film left on the table. Arkin and the Collector clash again, round 2, with the Collector coming out on top this time. Hannah hides, like Arkin has done throughout this film, and he's beaten into unconsciousness. He awakens hanging from even more hooks, with his hands bound, unable to defend himself. The Collector begins to torture him, cutting his forehead and chiseling out a tooth. When he thinks the Collector might detect Hannah's hiding spot, he reverses the technique he's used all night. He draws attention to himself by yelling at the Collector and calling him names. Unlike asking Victoria to scream to draw the Collector's attention away from him or forcing Larry back into his box to silence him, here he's finally doing something selflessly, accepting the torture to save an innocent. Isn't that what we do every day at work? We've all gone through hell to earn enough money to make our families safe. Isn't that the secret to the American dream? Not shortcuts, but a little sacrifice? Before it can get too far, however, a cop pulls up, responding to Jill's thwarted 911 call. And I love that, because it's such an elegant solution to the cell phone problem. I referenced it before, but if you're not well acquainted, The cell phone problem is a modern, stubborn trope that forces writers to deal with it. When so many of horror's old-school conflicts can be resolved with a simple smartphone call, writers are forever having the group leader have all the counselors put their phones in a bag, or a storm disrupting reception, or a shitty boyfriend throwing his cell phone in the party punch. Yeah, that one's the worst one. The collector lets the call happen and plays out the consequences. Simple, right? Certainly wouldn't be something that could be done every time, but it works here really, really, really well. The cop tracks the collector into the backyard and holds him at gunpoint, only to be attacked by the villain's dog. This is intercut with Arin mustering up enough nerve to break free of the hooks and bolts that have him captured. He's shedding blood at the same time as the cop, but for much more personal reasons. Once free, he hears Victoria screaming, so he and Hannah head into the basement bathroom one last time. But there he finds Victoria dead with her mouth sewn shut and one last booby trap, a mechanism to set off a flare above a gas canister. He's going to burn down the house, Arin says, and that's what the collector has always been about, right? Burning down the white picket fence suburban 2-car garage dream, with its family still inside. But more importantly, Arin discovers that Victoria's screams are coming from the collector's digital recording device. How many times has Arin used this same ploy against the collector? It's a sinister final confirmation that the two men, both dressed in black, both in masks when they entered, are one and the same. Not in the surface narrative, of course, but on a deeper storytelling level. The earlier scene where he asks Victoria to scream to save himself takes on a much darker meaning right now. Arin and Hannah escape up the laundry chute. Halloween 5 vibes even more with the collector's dog in pursuit, and a final showdown commences. But first, Arin sets the collector's dog on fire and tosses it into the path of the collector's shotgun, essentially blowing it into two pieces. Kind of like what he did to the Chase's cat, actually. And then they fight. Arin battles the collector, now as much out of a rejection of the American dream as for it. As he told the collector when he was bound in the basement, he just wants Hannah to survive. What happens to him has become secondary. And, because of that, he wins the fight. Heading to the front door, he and Hannah try fruitlessly to open the deadbolts the collector has installed. But the key he lifted off the villain is broken. They can't escape. Except, of course, there is a way. Using a mirror, he fools the collector into shotgunning the door. A mirror. You're not still wondering why that's the tool of his survival anymore, are you? And then, Arin triggers the knife chandelier trap we've been seeing all movie. It comes down on the collector hard, pinning him to the floor. Whose traps were these, really? Arin lifts Hannah into his arms and runs from the house. His future, or at least a totem of it, is secure, even if he'll never get to live in that dream house. He's hit by a police car while trying to flag it down for help. Hannah is safely ushered into the police cruiser's back seat. The house explodes in a fireball as he's loaded into the ambulance. The American dream is dead, or at least the one he's been blindly striving for all this time. Finally willing to sacrifice, he's won, and survived, and a happy ending seems inevitable. But then, he pulls the diamond he stole from the Chase's safe out of his pocket. He asks what time it is. It's not quite midnight. He says that he made it. Incredibly, he still hasn't given up on a shortcut answer, and so, the ambulance is struck by the exterminator's truck. He is dragged out of the wreck and hauled into the collector's vehicle before being tossed roughly into that antique box. Cue the title card. Very much a story of mortality and morality, in the vein of urban legends, nursery rhymes, and EC comics. A flawed man is given a chance to redeem himself, seems to succeed, but then ultimately is trapped. Inside an old box. Inside the dream of a better life. Inside the horrors of his own head. Arin will always be the man in the box. The Collector is a cautionary tale that seems to tell us to escape our own boxes and not search for what our culture or our society tells us our dreams should be, but to make our own, to accept our lives for the beautiful things that they are and not strive for someone else's life.